hope he still likes me after my presentation. I had a series of questions, and perhaps I'm going to be slightly disadvantaged because I answered the questions that they asked us to do, but I think in the interplay we'll be able to exchange views about transit. But one of the questions was, should local government regulate land use? And I think that it should regulate land use. Randal and I talked a little bit about this. I don't know that he knows that zoning is unconstitutional. He said he's not a constitutional lawyer, but it is of that ilk. I think zoning should be very narrowly applied, and I agree with that in general. I think that zoning is a right that is important, and it should support the public health, safety, and welfare. And I think that's what zoning should do in a local community. And I think that power is limited, and I think Randal might agree with me on this, although I'm not going to put words in Randal's mouth, certainly. That the power is limited by provisions of the Constitution, like the Takings Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and substantive due process. So it's a limited power. Zoning is a limited power. Local governments have to exercise that power consistent with public health, safety, and welfare, and its constitutional rights limit that power. One of them is takings, and another is the Equal Protection Clause. Another question was, should the government be responsible for ensuring a mix of race, ethnicity, and housing? That was another question. I'm sure Randal has an opinion on this one too, and I'd be interested in it. I think that the government cannot ensure racial balancing. I think that's probably prohibited by the Constitution, by Swan and many other cases since that time. But the government does have an obligation to fight discrimination. It has obligations to fight discrimination and to counter racial discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. So, for example, a bank that is loaning money in the Twin Cities, a bank that, a black family that earns $167,000 a year is less likely to qualify for a prime loan than a white family that earns $40,000 a year. This, I think, is a potential problem. That's just the hum to data. We have to look at all of the credit history. But if the credit histories match that HMDA data, that might be something that the government should be involved in. Steering, when real estate agents show minority families moving into the suburbs, different suburbs and different school districts than white families of the same income, credit history, and background. If real estate agents show people different neighborhoods, I think that's prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. And that seems to be happening fairly commonly in America, according to the Urban Institute's new study. When the government unduly concentrates affordable housing in non-white poor neighborhoods, I believe that's also prohibited by the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Protection Clause and Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The government can't build all the affordable housing in poor non-white neighborhoods, or even a disproportionate share. It should try to do its best to distribute it to every community. School districts cannot gerrymander school district boundary lines in a way that perpetuates or increases segregation. And I think the Supreme Court, even the most recent Supreme Court decisions, say pretty clearly that school districts can't draw boundaries that are intentionally racially segregated. There are other provisions of the Fair Housing Act. Section 3604 of the Fair Housing Act says that the government cannot perpetuate segregation. So if there's a segregated pattern, the government can't just maintain it knowingly. And there are also provisions that's more controversial, and I've read some of Randal's writings about this. There's an obligation for people to receive federal housing monies to affirmatively further fair housing. That's 3608 of the Fair Housing Act. It requires recipients of federal funds, not everybody, but recipients of federal funds, to try to do their best to make sure that they're not perpetuating segregation, that they're increasing choices. So I don't think the government can do racial balancing. I think Randal probably agrees with that. I'm sure Catherine Kirsten agrees with this too. But I do think the government has a responsibility to fight discrimination and under the Fair Housing Act to not perpetuate segregation and to affirmatively further fair housing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the local the local Met Council plans. And I had read a lot of Randal's work before I came, so I was kind of hoping you'd talk about urban growth boundaries, but I'm sure you will. That's all that's right. He's about urban growth boundaries. He's talking about transit, so we'll get into this in a minute. But he doesn't like urban growth boundaries, and he's argued that the Twin Cities that we have a tight urban growth boundary restricts the price of housing. And I wanted to look at this is the metropolitan area development map, and the areas that are dark red are the fully developed area. This is an old one from the mid-90s. And the areas that were orange were the developing suburbs. All you land use lawyers will know all about this. And then you have rural development areas. The green areas were zoned about 1 for 40, and the white areas were zoned 1 for 10, or at least that was the idea initially. So the most recent plan, though, I think Randal would like an awful lot. It expanded the growth boundaries very big, and those big yellow areas are what they call the rural use areas. So we defined a lot of areas, and you can do anything you want to. You can build on 2-acre lots. You can do pretty much whatever you want to. I call this the Randal O'Toole belt. We sort of followed his advice and decided to create kind of an anything goes area. Now, I personally think that that's not such a good idea in public policy, to have this Randal O'Toole belt that you can do anything you want to, 2-acre lots, septic systems, don't worry about the wells. Partly because in Minnesota we have kind of shallow superficial water. We have a lot of wells that are close to the surface. And we've had a long history of building on septic systems and them getting polluted by septic runoff. In fact, one of the reasons the Met Council was created was not to advance any giant social pointy-headed liberalism like I am often thought to represent, but to try to just keep the water clean and to try to keep the wells polluted. Now, Randal thinks that the market can solve these problems. That if you build enough wells and they pollute enough, then the market will fix this. I'm a little bit less sanguine about that. I think that these areas, in the Randal O'Toole belt, the big giant 2-acre lot areas are not doing so well. Their wells aren't doing so well. Their lakes aren't doing so well. And there's a lot of groundwater pollution there. And I wish that the Met Council would do a little bit more on that. And I also wish that they'd have an urban growth boundary like Portland's a little bit, which we really don't. We have kind of an anything goes area. Now this is a map that shows dot development. And you can see this is an urbanized area. These are satellite pictures from the Department of Forestry at the University of Minnesota that have been interpreted from satellites. And this is 1986. This is 1991. So you can see all the scattered edges, all the development at the edge of the region. This is 1998. This is 2002. So you can see the general pattern is pretty much anything goes. It's much more development on the outer edge, lots of 2-acre lots, not much observance of this. A mucil line that moves pretty much when anybody wants to. And I think in lots of ways we've adopted Randal's prescriptions for the region. I don't think it's been so good for us. I think it's caused congestion. I think it's polluted our groundwater. I think it's made it harder for us to manage some of our environmental resources. We have another part of this is affordable housing. And this is a little bit of where Randal may agree with me, but probably not. This is a sense that I think we both think that the zoning power, this is a narrow power that's limited by the takings clause. And I can ask Randal to respond to this when he speaks. I also think it's limited by other parts of the Constitution. And so that when a community uses its narrow zoning power, it shouldn't be zoning out apartment buildings and quads and townhomes and different types of development. I think the market should be able to respond. If people want apartment buildings, they should be able to build apartment buildings. If a private developer wants to build an apartment building or a more dense apartment building or wants to respond to a signal he ought to be able to do this. And a local response that doesn't like apartment buildings shouldn't impede the market. In the Twin Cities, in the Metropolitan Land Use Planning Act, we have a provision, and this was written a long time ago, that said that every community should provide for their fair share of affordable housing. That's in the Land Use Planning Act from 1975. This is also reflected in constitutional decisions in New Jersey and Oregon and Washington and many other states, where when people said that the zoning power is limited, they said that it's limited. A community can't zone out affordable housing. It can't eliminate that. It can't bar that. That is a constitutional violation. They don't have the local power. The legislature can't delegate them enough power so they can zone all people out of their communities. And the Met Council tried to implement that for a while. It tried to give everybody goals, and for a long time it did. These were the housing goals, kind of the fair share housing goals that were in 1990 to 2000. They got negotiated down quite a bit, so the outer ring communities, their goals got negotiated way down. The central cities got their goals way up again, and most of the poorer older suburbs got very high goals, which is kind of like it works in Detroit or Cleveland or Milwaukee. Most of the affordable housing is built in poor neighborhoods. This isn't social intervention. This is sort of nothing. These are the suburbs that are racially diverse, and most of those racially diverse suburbs got the highest housing goals, which I think is pretty consistent with doing nothing. These are the housing goals. You can see the central cities met their housing goals, and most of only the poorer suburbs did a good job. The rest of them didn't do a very good job at all. This is map of land use planning, and I'm a fan of where Randal's from. I think Portland does a pretty good job. This is looking at land use in Portland, Seattle, and the Twin Cities. The top line is the amount of land use, the bottom line is population. And I think planning means thinking about your future, using your scarce resources carefully, trying to protect the environment to the extent that it doesn't take anyone else's rights away, trying to do the best you can with limited resources. Portland and Seattle are both growing in land area about as fast as they're growing in population. That doesn't seem so bad to me. That seems like a good thing. I don't think there's any evidence. I would disagree with Randal that this is driving the cost of housing up. He talks a lot about Portland's housing prices going up in his articles, but he doesn't note that Salt Lake City's housing prices are going up faster, Denver's housing prices are going up faster, and many other western cities are going up faster that have no land use planning regulations or only NIMBY regulations. So I think that planning and thinking about growing an area, providing the infrastructure, trying to have a proportional number of sewers and roads to actually deal with the land that's growing and to make land available on an efficient, orderly basis, I think this is the sensible plan of any large corporation, of any private market industry. I think you try to do the best you can. You don't just throw money away. You just don't let problems occur. You don't just try to remediate things after you've wrecked all the lakes and groundwaters and wells. You try to do the best you can to think about what's going to happen. And I think if you take a look at Portland and Seattle, they're doing a lot better on using land and providing infrastructure. They're not wasting as much money chasing things that shouldn't have happened as we are. Now this is a number of things I care about, and other people probably don't. It's the number of schools that are segregated, racially segregated. And Seattle and Minneapolis and Portland are three of the whitest metropolitan areas in the country. They're very similar in terms of race. Seattle and Minneapolis have about the same percentage of Black and Latino people. They have more Asian people than we do. Portland has got more Latino people than we do, but fewer Blacks, but overall they're a little bit more diverse than we are. Now, Portland has 2 racially segregated schools. Seattle has 25, up from 14, and the Twin Cities has 83, up from 11. And we've built almost every bit of our affordable housing in the boundaries of those 83, or the school districts right around that. We haven't enforced our own laws or our own principles that everybody ought to do the same. We haven't let the market go free and build apartment buildings where it wishes to. We haven't let builders decide what land needs to be built or let the private market decide whether apartment buildings. We let local communities do this. A number of the places that Randal cites in his studies where housing costs are so expensive are not because of regional planning, but they're because of local NIMBYism. So places like San Francisco and Boston, their housing prices are very high. But it's not because of regional planning, it's because nobody in those communities wants to build anything. That local NIMBYism is different than having regional planning. And long-term regional planning is providing plenty of land for growth and making sure the infrastructure is there in place so that growth can occur seamlessly. This seems sensible. Local NIMBYism is nothing, no time, nowhere, no how. And that raises up the cost of housing. And I think that most of Randal's examples relate to that more than they do to regional planning places. Let's see. I think I've answered the questions, and I think that I want to talk about transit a little bit more in my rebuttal period of time. So maybe Randal's going to let me have it.